Hey, Beastista here, and welcome to Week 4 Power Rankings of the VDL-V Create. Sadly, this week I am by myself since myself and Matrix actually recorded the entire Power Rankings, the two of us. But as the video was saving, my computer crashed and it corrupted the file, and I was unable to recover the file. And so now I have to redo the entire Power Rankings myself. This is doubly sad because Matrix can't come back, and they were definitely the more interesting and insightful opinions on this week's Power Rankings. So I'll hopefully do my best to, make up for that. So with that, let's get into the specific matches this week. So up first is the Rolled Gold Pretzels versus the Baltimore Pangorials. The Pangorials are able to get their third win of the season, winning 2-0 against the Pretzels. So I guess we'll start with game one of this match. Turn one of game one was very interesting. Scolipede had Steel Roller, and the Pangorials led with Rillaboom, setting up grassy terrain. The Scolipede targeted, I believe it was the Azumarill, on turn one, and the Pangorial switched into an Aerodactyl, taking the Steel Roller, getting the one shot and getting rid of the grassy terrain, giving a huge momentum shift to the Pretzels. However, after that, the Pretzels weren't in the best position. They were having strong difficulties being able to offensively deal with the Nidoking. In addition to that, the Nidoking basically threatened to one-shot every single Pokemon that the Pretzels brought. In addition to that, the Pangorials were able to kind of, get the Rillaboom out and get it back in to threaten fake out support and then grassy chloride damage as well as that. And, that's definitely kind of what happened the most game one. Game two, I think turn one was incredibly bad for the Pretzels. They ended up leading Swampert in front of the Rillaboom, and the Rillaboom just went for a grassy glide in front of the Swampert and got the clean one-hit KO. I can't quite remember if the Aerodactyl was in on the Pangorials and the Unnerved maybe prevented it from having a Rindo Berry or not, but it was very devastating because the Swampert was definitely the best answer that the Pretzels had to deal with the Nidoking. And in addition to that, um, it kind of snowballed really quickly after that, and I believe like the Pangorials were able to get up Tailwind and outspeed and kind of do huge chunks of damage, and then the terrain also gave them good speed control with grassy glides. So that definitely not the not the best performance for the Pretzels, but it was a very impressive showing for the Pangorials. So up next, we have the match against the Alexandria Arcanines versus the Miss Magical Marauders. This match was incredibly close. It went 3 games, with the Arcanines just barely winning. Game 1, the Arcanines were able to get up a turn 1 Trick Room with very little pressure from the Marauders. However, the Marauders were able to switch in Guzzlord as a means to counter the Trick Room. However, the awkward part of this, and basically the entirety of the set, was that Guzzlord, though it has a very low base speed, was actually not min speed. And it not being min speed made some Pokemon that naturally should be slower or should be faster than it, like Klotzer and Berserker, were actually underspeeding Guzzlord, which means that they were going faster when Trick Room was up. And I definitely think that was one of the bigger issues with the entirety of the set on the Marauder side, because their Guzzlord would have been a very good answer to a lot of these Pokemon if they were able to underspeed, but because they were slower in Trick Room, they definitely weren't able to pressure as much. And in addition to that, Beheeyem being power or Meteor Beam was a really big deal because Guzzlord's offensive damage into Beheeyem was knockoff. And Beheeyem having power or Meteor Beam got rid of its item, one, which made knockoff not do as much damage, and also offensively, Beheeyem became very threatening. So they're definitely the big thing. I know game 2, the Marauders were able to kind of pressure with a Me and Shao lead, making it significantly harder for the Arcanines to be able to get up Trick Room. And with that, they were able to kind of get a very clean win in that match. And I think they didn't even lose a single Pokemon because they kind of were able to get early KO and prevent Trick Room completely. And then game 3, the Arcanines kind of adjusted and led with the Fungus and Beheeyem lead, went for the double protect, and then were able to Rage Shatter Trick Room. And then once they were in Trick Room, they kind of were able to, finish up the game, get command in position. And then when Trick Room was over, I think they finished up the game with the Dragapult. It was definitely pretty close. If the Miss Mag had maybe safety goggles with one of their leads in game 3, or if they read the turn 1 double protect and had a feint, which was revealed at some point on the Mean Show, they might have been able to get the game 3 win. But I definitely think the biggest problem, which I think is completely could have changed the match, was the fact that their Guzzlord was not min speed, and that kind of led to a huge problem with Trick Room. When if it was min speed, I think they might have been able to get the set. So with that, next up is my match against the Bulky Dragons. So from my perspective, the Bulky Dragons, my main goal was to kind of prevent Trick Room, and that was definitely, I think, their main strategy going into the game. Thing was trying to get up Trick Room. I just figured out that my main way to prevent Trick Room was to have Choice Band Scyther, and then in addition to that, have Taunt on my Tornadus. So the idea is that both of their Trick Room setters would be threatened to be one shot by Scyther with Choice Band, and then I could taunt anything that as well with the Tornadus. And so game 1, I just let Scyther Tornadus, and the pressure of the Choice Band Scyther kind of just completely dominated the game, and I definitely don't think they were expecting that much damage output, and maybe even Scyther at all. Game 2, they ended up leading Gengar Paloswine, and I went in to kill Gengar to make sure it doesn't set up Trick Room. I got the turn 1 kill, but they hit Rock Slide and killed my Scyther. My Scyther ended up being a little bit EV'd, and I was expecting to guarantee survive that. However, I only survived that. I think it was like 31% of the time, something like that. And I got they got the roll to kill me. And after that, my damage output was severely lowered, and from there, I was having problems killing a lot of Pokemon, namely the Paloswine, and they were kind of able to get it from there. Game 3 was incredibly close. We led the same leads, and I was able to pivot out the Scyther with U-turn to save it. And the game basically ended up coming down to an ally switch read, where I misread the ally switch, and they were able to get up Trick Room with the Gengar. If I would have doubled up the right spot, killed the Gengar, I think I probably win because they wouldn't have Trick Room up, but definitely hard to tell. But once they were able to get Trick Room up and me misreading the ally switch, they were able to kind of get into a situation where it was hard for me to do anything, and they were able to get the win. So up next, we have the live premiere, which was the Welsh Wailords versus the Trixie Tricos, in which the Welsh Wailords won 2-0. So this was definitely a very interesting match. It was a weather war where the Wailords brought both their hell and their rain package with both their, both Pelipper, Aurorus, and then Arctozolt and Seismitoad, both of them having Slush Rush and Swift Swim, where the Tricos brought their Ninetales in all of the matches as well. So game 1, I think the big deciding point, or the big, point that was very interesting, was turn 1, when the Wailords decided to go in front of a Charizard, which in front of the Charizard, which could easily Heat Wave and hit both of the ice Pokemon in front of it, decided to protect, and the Arctozolts decided to ignore the Charizard and go for the double up into the Raichu. And the double up into the Raichu killed Raichu before it could move, because the Aurorus was Choice Scarfed, and the Charizard's Protect ended up being completely useless. And with that, the Wailords were kind of in a very good turn 1 position. And from there, it was kind of hard for the Tricos to come back, especially with the fact that they could switch in the rain mode and make the weather hard for the Tricos to control. Game 2 was a lot more close. There was a lot of back and forth, and I think there was definitely a little bit of luck involved that kind of led to this. I think one of the big deciding factors actually ended up being the fact that the Tricos actually ended up going with a very interesting Tapu Fini set. They went with a Tapu Fini that didn't have Misty Surge. It, in addition to that, it had Iron Defense, Calm Mind, Scald, and then yeah. So they Nature's Madness was its fourth move. And so what ended up happening that I think decided it was because they weren't Misty Surge, a Pelipper hitting a Hurricane caused a confusion on the Tapu Fini, which if Misty Surge was up would have prevented that, and that ended up leading to the Tapu Fini hitting itself once, I think maybe even twice. And if either of those didn't occur, I think they ended up winning because the game ended up coming down to basically a nail biter where the Pelipper needed to hit a 70% accurate Hurricane, and if it didn't, then the Tricos definitely win the game. This was definitely a very fun and interesting match, especially because we had a lot of like not only weather wars, but we also had scarf wars because the Aurorus and the Sock were both scarfed, and the Sock just threatened so much damage and one shot the Aurorus. But the but the Wellords were able to position quite effectively and kind of make the Aurorus, which is not the most bulky Pokemon in the general sense, be able to survive a lot. So next up, we have the match against the Somerville Scraggies and the Brisbane Blazikens. So this was a really fun match as well, despite it being a 2-0 in favor of the Scraggies. So the big one was that so the Blazikens decided to lead with a Choice Scarf Mamoswine game 1, which seemed very good. However, the problem was the Cobalion, which Mamoswine was most likely his main goal was to kind of threaten that Cobalion, what happened to be Air Balloon. And so with Air Balloon, being able choice carving into Earthquake or other ground moves was really tricky because you had to break the balloon on the Cobalion. In addition to that, they had a Dugtrio, the Somerville Scraggies had a Dugtrio that bulldozed to lower the speed of the Mamoswine, making it not as fast either. So that definitely was very interesting. The Dugtrio ended up not doing too much work, especially because the Blazikens had two Pokemon that were immune to ground in Mesprit and Togekiss. So other than that, the game definitely came down to the Somerville Scraggies kind of making sure to save their Cobalion, because it was the main way that they threatened pretty much three of the four major threats of the Blazikens, which was the Duraludon, the Togekiss, and the Mamoswine. And so I believe they were able to save it till the end and get a pretty much a one-hit KO on the Duraludon, which was AV, which was going to be pretty much impossible for the Scraggies to break with their Primarina. They also brought the Orbeetle in game 1. The Orbeetle did massive amounts of work with its Struggle Bug Recover set. It took a huge chunk of damage, a lot of damage, and lowered the special attack of the Mesprit and Togekiss. In addition to that, there was a fun situation with the double Scarf Mons and figuring out which ones were faster, because the Somerville Scraggies had Scarf Alakazam in front of the Mamoswine, and the Alakazam I think outsped and he got an energy off, but just barely missed on the KO, and the Mamoswine was able to get pretty much the KO with that. The Orbeetle did a huge chunk of work, but it definitely kind of came down to positioning, making sure that they can keep the Cobalion in the back. I think at one point the air balloon ended up causing major problems for the Blazikens, because the Blazikens needed to lock in Mamoswine into Icicle Crash, even though Primarina and Cobalion were the two Pokemon on the field, because if they locked into Earthquake, the game was guaranteed over, because the air balloon would ever be broken. and Kabalion could just sit there and pretty much be immune. And so definitely the air balloon ended up being a massive ring and was probably one of the deciding factors in the match. And the Blazekins, were pretty close, but sadly they couldn't get their first win of the season. So with that, we can go to the next match, which was Rebellion versus the SARS. This was an interesting match. So this was the set which, if y'all didn't know, that Rebellion decided to bring Inte with Choice Band, Raikou with Choice Scarf, and Suicune with Choice Specs, I believe. And so Triple Scarf was very interesting. The Raikou and Suicune just did so much damage. The Raikou was able to, I think, Scald did massive damage into the Hippowdon. Same with Scald on the Suicune. The Ice Beam on the Suicune did huge damage into the Archelops and Dracozolt and Hippowdon. And the Entei had extreme speed, Choice Band extreme speed, did massive damage even to the resisted, even from resisted mons like the Archeops. So game one basically, I think it basically just came down to just sheer pressure that Rebellion put onto the SARS. The SARS weren't able to kind of, overcome that pressure. The SARS also had an interesting set, which I think in the end ended up not being particularly that exciting. It was a special Dracozolt with Power Herb Meteor Beam. And sadly, though, the Power Herb Meteor Beam, I think both Game 1 and Game 2 went into the Suicune. And Suicune only took like 30%, maybe a little bit more, but did not take much damage at all from 120 base power move at +1 special attack. And I definitely, so it was like a cool attack, but ended up not working out particularly well. And the Suicunes kind of just, were able to threaten massively with Ice Beam on the Specs Suicune into the Dracozolt. I think Game 2, they also, the SARS actually had a cool tech that ended up doing a little bit of work, but ended up not doing quite enough, where they did the skill swap Meowstic and Toxapex. And so the Toxapex was able to get a Prankster, and so it could Prankster Recover, Prankster Toxic. And then the Meowstic gained the ability where it crit any times it hit a Pokemon that was poisoned. And so you had a kind of this cool thing where you could priority Toxic something and then Psychic and get guaranteed crits on it. Definitely was a cool tech, but in the end, not quite enough with just the sheer power of Choice Spec Suicune. The Mr. Rhyme kind of came Game 2, which I think ended up doing a lot of work, namely as a good switch in to like Freeze Dry. In addition, its Freeze Dry itself did massive damage or threatened massively the Dracozolt, the Hippowdon, and the Toxapex that all came in Game 2. So with that, the next match was the Porygons versus the Drowsy Dracozolts. So the Porygons ended up winning a 3-game set, and it was very close. The Porygons had a really cool item that most people wouldn't expect, which is Protective Pads Urshifu. In order to, I think, mainly the only reason for it was to not get hit by Iron Barbs on the Ferrothorn, which ended up being very important. I can't remember which game, but I want to say it was Game 1 that it ended up basically coming down to the difference between the damage that would have been dealt by Iron Barbs. In addition to that, the Porygons ended up bringing their Bronzong, Dragalge, Weakness Policy Bulldoze set, and it ended up not doing huge amount of work in Game 1, but I think it ended up doing a lot of work in Game 3. The Dracozolts were definitely leaning on their Ferrothorn. That was one of their main strategies. The Ferrothorn looked very good into pretty much all the mons except the Urshifu, because the Urshifu definitely threatened it greatly. And so, especially since I think the Ferrothorn ended up being AV, so it didn't have like the Iron Defense set where it could increase its defenses. So yeah, so one thing that I found very interesting in this set was just how difficult it was for the Dragazolts to get clean kills on the Urshifu. Urshifu is definitely a Pokemon that most people wouldn't consider particularly bulky, but it definitely took 2-3 hits, multiple games, and it ended up doing a massive amount of damage. There was a couple of fun Pokemon that were ended up being brought, like the Togepi and the Volbeat, and I think Game 3. But for the most part, it ended up basically coming down to the Ferrothorn and the Politoed were the main mons on the Dragozolt side, and then the Urshifu and the Bronzong were kind of the main mons on the Porygon side, and definitely showed the power of those mons from the Porygon side. So I guess with that, we can go to the next match, which was the Brother Bash. This was the match against Sakimoto and Goomer, and this was incredibly fun set, and we kind of got to see the brothers play, but I definitely think it was very strongly performance from Saki specifically. So the big thing that I think ended up doing a lot of work was, so game one, Sakimoto had Choice Scarf, Thunderous with Electro Web, and it just kept on clicking Electro Web, lowering the speed on that side, and that just ended up causing so much difficulty for the Bashers. I think the Bashers ended up not even killing it and just stayed in the entire game clicking Electro Web every single turn. I think it ended up getting a turn 1 kill on Cramorant, or maybe it was a turn 2 kill. I think it got a one shot on Cramorant at some point before Cramorant was able to get its first move off. In addition to that, the pressure of the priority on the Cramorant and the Scizor ended up being really difficult. And then I think the Naganadel just outspeeding everything and getting poison coverage was able to kind of do huge chunks of damage into the Clefable. So game 2 ended up being incredibly close, and it ended up coming down to this really interesting in-game where it was Clefable versus Torracat, and Torracat's only damaging move was Overheat, and Clefable's only damaging move into Torracat was basically Moonblast. And so they were both doing tiny amounts of damage, but Torracat's special attack was dropping more and more as it clicked Overheat. And basically the game came down to just, would Torracat get a crit or not? And it ended up never getting the crit. And Clefable was able to get the win and get Goomer the win that match. It was definitely an incredibly close. I think the Spectre lead ended up doing a lot of work for the Bashers, and definitely pressured them and was able to kind of make it pretty tricky for the SARS. And then finally game 3, I think basically another game that was very commanding on the SARS. The SARS pressured incredibly with Priority Scizor, Priority Cramorant, and in addition to that, they had the Naganadel, which which was outspeeding pretty much everything on the team, especially after a speed drop from like an Electro Web, and it did massive chunks of damage. There's the cool tech on the Basher side where they had a Choice Band Uxie, but the Choice Band Uxie just didn't do enough damage to their team. And definitely one of the downsides of Uxie, which is it's an incredibly bulky Pokemon, but it does not have the best offensive stats. And without its good offense, or without any really meaningful offensive stats, the Choice Band version just didn't do enough damage. And in addition to that, Aqua Jet on Crawdont, Bullet Punch on Scizor, Choice Scarf, Electro Web on Thunderous. Basically, the SARS were kind of always going first every single match, and definitely causing massive problems for the Bashers. So with that, we can go to the next match, which is Gurchins versus the Beantown Binacles. So this one definitely was an interesting set. The main game plan it looked like the Gurchins were trying to do was setting up Trick Room. And so I believe game 1 they led the Raichu and the Gourgeist to get Fake Out into Trick Room. And they had a really cool tech in Iron Ball Tyranitar that had Fling, and so they could fling Iron Ball, and Iron Ball did huge chunks of damage into into most Pokemon because Fling is, I think, 120 base power move if you're holding Iron Ball. And then if you do that the last turn of Trick Room, which is what they did, then the Tyranitar could be fast outside of Trick Room because it loses its Iron Ball. However, what ended up happening was the Gurchins really couldn't abuse the Trick Room much. The Nidoqueen just was massively threatening to all of their Mons in Trick Room and could take a lot of hits from the Mons in Trick Room. I believe at some point the Pincurchin was in front of the Nidoqueen and did a Hydro Pump, and it hardly did. I think it hardly did enough to two-shot the Nidoqueen, and the Nidoqueen's Earth Power were just massively threatening. In addition to that, the Binacles were able to get a lot of fake out pressure themselves with the Hitmonchan, and I believe they also had priority Mach Punch with Hitmonchan in addition to that. And so definitely was pretty hard, despite because they weren't the Gurchins weren't really able to abuse the Trick Room that well. In addition to that, the Gurchins had this really weird Poltergeist set where it had Leech Seed, Poltergeist, Trick Room, and I want to say Protect was its last move. But it might have been something else. But the big problem with that is, as you can see, is that there's no offensive move to hit the Stoutland, which was brought by the Binacles both games, and the only thing you can really do is Leech Seed, and Stoutland was able to pressure with Crunch. In addition to that, I believe one of the Pokemon has a Citrus Berry, and when it lost the Citrus Berry, Poltergeist basically couldn't touch it either. And so the Goldgeist kind of was trying to sit there clicking Leech Seeds. However, it took so much damage from the Heatran and the Nidoqueen and the Stoutland that it really couldn't be the bulky Leech Seed Mon that effectively. And it definitely, I think, was one of the big issues with the Gurchin's game plan, was that it just kind of died so quickly. Game 2 was very interesting because we got to see Flaffle, which I believe this might have been the first time it ever appeared in the VDL-V. And it did a lot of work. I think at some point it switched into a ground move and took it very well. And then mainly it was there for Sucker Punch, because Sucker Punch did really good into the Game 2 Pokemon that the Gurchins brought, which were Articuno and Gourgeist. The Appleton doesn't have the best offensive stats, but Sucker Punch, super effective Sucker Punch, is still very powerful into even with not super strong base attack Mons. In addition, I think Game 2, if I recall, the Gurchins had struggles getting up Trick Room, and with the difficulties of getting up Trick Room, the Tyranitar having Iron Ball ended up being really awkward because it was very slow, and everything kind of just outsped it. And so with that, that's kind of the game. I definitely think that the Gurchins kind of just needed a little bit more strength under Trick Room, since it looked like their main game plan was kind of setting up Trick Room, and they just kind of weren't able to get enough out of it. So with that, the next match is the Coffin Smokers versus the Helisopod Warriors. The Warriors were able to get a 2-0 win. So the Warriors had a really fun couple the first one to mention is the Angoro, which was Mold Breaker, and the Mold Breaker ended up being really relevant because the Mold Breaker game 2 specifically they were able to taunt a Spritzee even though it had Aroma Veil, which prevents it from being taunted normally. In addition to that, it had Circle Throw and Foul Play as its offensive moves in order to play around the Intimidate from the Gyarados. Because Circle Throw always crits, and then Foul Play uses the offensive output of your opponent's Pokemon rather than your own. And then I believe its last move was Crotrine. And then the other cool set was the Tornadus, which was a weakness policy Tornadus with Substitute. So game 1, I think the Coffin Smokers were able to get a really good start of the match, where they both traded fake outs turn 1, and the Pangorial game 2, however, Kangaskhan was encored into fake out, and so it was the standard fake out last resort set with only 2 moves, but it was fake out, and so it couldn't really do much damage. And so basically it was forced to switch out, and it was switched out into the Tornadus, and the substitute weakness policy Tornadus did huge chunks of damage. It's it's hurt. I think the Warriors ended up hitting a lot of 70% accurate hurricanes, which did huge chunks of damage into the Conkeldurr. The Pangorial, I think, was able to get a one-shot on the Lopunny with the circle throw. And I believe the Tornadus also had Icy Wind, which did massive damage into the Garchomp that from the Coffin Smokers. And so definitely was a a very commanding or really powerful turn 2 from the Smokers, where they were able to encore a Pokemon, making it completely useful and forcing a switch out, but it ended up not being enough momentum for them. And then game 2, like I mentioned a little bit, I kind of gave a little preview. Turn 1, the Smokers were trying to set up Trick Room, and Pangoro was able to taunt it with the Mold Breaker. And without them being able to set up Trick Room, the Smokers kind of had a lot of difficulties throughout the game. Namely, they had to focus a lot on the Tornadus, and with them focusing on the Tornadus, the Aggron and the Inteleon were able to kind of pick off the Mons on the Smoker side, doing massive damage with Head Smash into the Gyarados. I think Body Press and the Aggron into the Lopunny, and then the Inteleon having Icy Wind and Water Snape Shot. So definitely was a fun set. It was very close, and there was definitely some cool tech on the sides, but ended up being a 2-0 in favor of the Glissopods or Helisopods. Up next, we have the match against the Cambridge Camerups and the Old English Ice Cubes. The Cambridge Camerups were able to get a 2-1 win. So one thing that I want to note out is that Fletchling was actually incredibly impressive in this week's match. And I know a lot of people in our previous videos, I can't recall who, but I think Miss Mag specifically might have mentioned it, but I think maybe even multiple people said that Fletchling was not great on the Camerups team, but it looked very good. It had Overheat, which did 60-70% into Lucario. It had Will-O-Wisp, which was very annoying for the damage output of the Lucario. And in addition to that, Priority Tailwind ended up being very impactful. In addition to that, the Camerups had massive damage output with the Skunk Tank, who, I'm sure everyone knows I love Skunk Tank. I've drafted it multiple times in this league itself. And its Play Rough ended up doing huge damage into the Latios that was brought on the ICU side. In addition, it did huge damage on the Obstagoon. And then the Poison coverage did massive damage into the Tapu Koko, and the Dark coverage, though neutral, did very good damage into the Mimikyu. So the big thing that I think the Cameras ended up bringing the same 4 Mons, which was Fletchling, Hitmontop, Magnezone, and Skunk Tank. Magnezone threatened the Melodic on the Ice Cube side. The Skunk Tank kind of threatened most of the Latias and the Obstagoon. And so the big threat ended up coming down to basically of Obstagoon seemed like the big offensive threat on the Ice Cube side, with it being Guts and Flame Orb. And so the Camerups basically need to make sure to outspeed it and kill it quickly, or double up on it. And that pressure in game 2 of that ended up being too much and leading to the Ice Cubes getting able to win. But in game 3, they were able to kill it very quickly, and that kind of led to the Camerups getting a clean game 3 win. The Ice Cubes ended up, not being able to kind of just break through some of the more bulky offensive threats that did 2 chunks of damage and were pretty bulky. Definitely it was a fun set. Not much else to say on it. And so with that, we have the last match of the week, which was the Melmetalors versus the Mimikyus, where the Mimikyus were able to win 2-0. So this was another interesting set. The Mimikyus were kind of able to threaten the Regigigas and Weezing lead of the Melmetals in game one with with the Bolton and the Blaziken. Blaziken having fighting coverage and the Bolton having Charm, which was able to lower the offensive output of the Regigigas. And so game one, the Mimikyus were able to kind of get Trick Room up, and under Trick Room, the Hatterene was able to one-shot the Weezing and was able to do 2 chunks of damage to the rest of the team, and then the Gliscopod was basically able to clean up in the end. Ended up being very close, though. I think the decision to lead both Blaziken and Bolton rather than leading the Trick Room mode ended up costing him a little bit. One of the downsides that we kind of see, and one of my complaints on the Melmetals team to a certain extent, is that I think the Weezing Regigigas core, which is one of the big cores that they've been leaning on, is not as effective as they would like it to be in general, and it definitely leads to a lot of problems with them, especially when some of the Pokemon die. Game two was very interesting because the Melmetals ended up going with Hippopotamus, whatever, Baby Hippowdon, and Dracozolt, and giving a Sand mode. But the Sand mode ended up not working out as they would like, because the Dracozolt ended up just not getting many opportunities to do huge chunks of damage and was killed pretty quickly by, I think, Mudstell Earth Power, or maybe it was Drill Run on Golisopod. But the Hippopotamus, whatever, had a really cool set with Amnesia, Slack Off, Yawn, and then I think High Horsepower as its moveset. But at some point, I think the Melmetals ended up switching out their boosted Hippopotamus, and I don't know if I necessarily agreed with that decision at the time. And after moving out of that situation, they kind of lost a little bit of momentum, and they were able to kind of get into this interesting end game where it was Gliscopod versus Hippopotamus, and the Gliscopod was basically going to die in 2 turns from Sand Chip, and so it needed to get pretty much close to a one-shot on liquidation, and it did 80% and was able to kill the Hippopotamus. And definitely kind of shows one of the reasons why I'm not a huge fan of getting the low budget weather setters. I'm more of a fan of getting the low budget weather sweepers, and definitely kind of sees as a little bit strength, even though it did do a fair amount of work. So with that, the Mimikyus were kind of getting able to get a clean win, but it was definitely close. Both of them came down to 1 Pokemon left, where I think game 1 was definitely a little bit more commanding of a win, but it's not. Neither of them were particularly commanding. It was very close on both of those sides. And so with that, we can go to our official rankings. So starting off, we have number 24, which is the Blizzblame Blazikens. There's not much to say except that they are currently 0-4, and they're the only 0-4 team, so that's the main reason why they're last. In addition to that, they ended up getting 2-0 this week, so not too surprising that they're still number 24. However, they did make a change. They were able to pick up the Raboot, and I believe they dropped I want to say Mawile, but I'm not 100% sure if they dropped. It makes sense. They don't have a fire Pokemon currently on their team, so having that makes some amount of sense. I think Mawile is a very powerful Pokemon, so it's not that not bad to have had on their team, but with that, they added that. Up next for number 23 is the Tindo Melmetals. The Melmetals dropped, I believe, Lowland Ductrio and picked up the Lurantis. I think that this helps a little bit with having a actual Trick Room, a more Trick Room mon, I think. Because currently they don't really have a Trick Room on, so they Jellicent's Trick Room is not a huge deal. I think they're really only reasonable Trick Rooms, sweeper before this pickup was the Dracozolt, and so I definitely think it's a reasonable pickup. In addition to this, I think their team is a little bit weak to water, I believe, and this gives them a water resist, which is also big. other than that, Melmetal's are kind of low because, for example, I think partially a lot of people are kind of losing the faith, if they had any, in the Regigigas Weasley core, which I think is a huge component of their team. And, it definitely needs to show some work. If not, we're going to kind of continue ranking them lowly because that seems like a huge component of their team. Next up is number 22, which is my team. I had a pretty close game, but I ended up losing. And then obviously, being a mono flying team, my team is inherently not as powerful as most other teams. So not too surprising. I'm one of the lower 1-3 teams. After that, we have the Drowsy Dracozolt. The Dracozolts, I think some people kind of don't quite understand the team. Some people don't really like the bulky, not super fast archetype, which is fair. And in addition, the Dracozolts, the Dracozolts had a couple trades, so kind of hard to predict their team too much. Number 20, we have the Old English Ice Cubes, which is another team that had a bunch of trades. They had 4 trades going into week 4. So it's kind of a little hard to predict them too much of what their team, what their team is going to look like because of that. They had a very close game this week, but being 1-3 puts them kind of down here. Next up, we have number 19, the Mismagical Marauders. I personally really like this team. I'm very concerned because I have to play them this week and not week 5, so we'll see how that goes. In addition to that, they've had really close sets. Most of their losses have been really close, and so they seem like 1 or 2 minor decision points away from maybe being 2-2 or 3-1. So definitely understand why they're one of the highest. But the highest 1-3 team, actually no, this is the second highest 1-3 team actually, is the Rolled Gold Pretzels. Gumi has had a 1-3 season. They ended up making a trade where they got rid of their Scolipede, which at the beginning of the season they were telling us how amazing it was going to be and how it deserved to be in tier 3. And then since then they've decided it's terrible. And they decided to add Azelf. So Azelf honestly fills a pretty similar role to Scolipede. My mind point, which is a pretty fast offensive mon. The plus side of it is it's more offensive, so it just has a bigger damage output, which might be one of the things that they're looking for. In addition, it does give them a ground immunity, which their team was a little weak to ground before this. And with that, hopefully they can kind of shift it around because they historically are one of the best teams in the VDL, and they've definitely had a pretty slow start. I wouldn't be surprised if this is their slowest start ever. So hopefully they can turn it around. Next up, we have number 17, Georgia Gurchins. Georgia Gurchins are the highest 1-3 ranked team. They were very high ranked in the week 0 power rankings. But since then, they've made a couple trades in which they've recently just added Sneasel for their Alolan Raichu and the Vaporeon for their Turtonator. With these trades, I'm a big fan of the Vaporeon. I think that's really impactful to their team, giving them a little bit more damage into the ground weakness they had, and then the Sneasel not being able to be faked out and fake out support. I personally was a fan of the Alolan Raichu, but they said they weren't particularly impressed with it as a mon, and they thought they wanted a more versatile fake out mon. And this was definitely the most versatile and the best fake out mon in the Alolan Raichu's tier. So hopefully those changes can help them get around, turn around their season because they started off a little bit slow with 1-3. Next up, we have the lowest 2-2 team, which is the MK Mimikyus. Honestly, I think they're a little bit underranked in my opinion, but not by too much. I think they had a very impressive win this week. In addition to this, I think just the NDD and Hatterene core is really hard to deal with in the general sense, and the Gliscopod they're very comfortable with and has definitely been doing a lot of work. So definitely interested to see how the rest of their season goes. Next up, we have 15, which is the Coffin Smokers. The Coffin Smokers had a pretty tough loss this week, but definitely have shown some strengths in their team. They definitely have, interestingly enough, been seem to kind of be more focused on their lower tier mons. They they haven't really used their Garchomp too much. They definitely seem to be very much like the Spritzee and the Lopunny core, and like the Conkeldurr, and so definitely interesting to see how their season progressed. Next up, number 14, which is the SARS. The SARS had a pretty tough loss this week with against Lucian and Rebellion. They definitely shown some very interesting things with their team, showing some incredibly grindy and interesting sets. I think they've almost exclusively had a cool tech in every single match, and definitely one of the reasons why they're probably a little bit higher, but they're not the highest 2-2 teams probably because some people aren't a huge fan of what some of these more grindy matches and adding some variance for and kind of being susceptible to crits maybe. So with that, we can go to number 13, which is the Holisapod Warriors. So the Warriors dropped their dissuasion baby Reuniclus for the Mawile. So Intimidate seems pretty useful on their team. However, one thing that's a little bit awkward is that they now visually have no way to set up Trick Room. And so some of their Slittermons now, they don't have the dual speed mode. They can only either be bulky or they have to be in Tailwind, which is a little bit awkward in my opinion. And maybe, however, we definitely have seen that the Warriors have been doing some good amount of work, and they really haven't seemed like they needed Trick Room at any point. So hopefully Mawile can do some work for them. Next up, we have 12, which is the Somerville Scraggies. I personally like the Somerville Scraggies. They're one of my favorite 2-2 teams. They've had incredibly close matches. Not only that, all their losses have been to really high good teams. They're all been some of the higher ranked teams. We definitely have seen with their addition to Primarina some additional like bulk and strength in their team, and their fast core of Cobalion, Cinderace, and Alakazam has been very impressive. And we finally got to see their Orbeetle, which they kind of told me previously that they really wanted to run Orbeetle this season, and it did a lot of work this week's match. Next up, we have number 11, which is the Beantown Binacles. The Binacles had a pretty impressive win this week, and they definitely have shown the strength of their, Stoutland and Nidoqueen core, and then their pickup of Hitmonchan seemed to be very impactful. This is another thing that's really strange to me. One thing that's strange to this team is they've not particularly used Whimsicott that much, which is their tier 1, and I think it was their first overall pick. And they've definitely been leaning on their Nidoqueen, Stoutland core, which is very interesting, especially with Stoutland not having sand at all. But however, I think it is a very good Intimidate mon, so not too surprising, despite with that. So next up, we have number 10, which is the Bulky Dragons, who beat me this week in a close set. Since then, they decided to add 2 new Pokemons. They decided to drop Lurantis and pick up Tangela. And I can't remember what they dropped for Crustle. But with this, they get some redirection, which I'm assuming can help them with Trick Room modes. And in addition, redirection next to Crustle with Shell Smash is always a good power. In addition to that, they definitely have had some pretty impressive sets, and they've seen and we've seen some power of like Klefki and some of their other mons. So with that, we have number 9, which is the Trixie Tricos. The Tricos were one of the, I think, 3rd highest in their week 0 power rankings, and they lost to the current one of the 2 4-0 teams this week. So it's not too surprising that they're one of the highest 2-2 teams. In addition, as a coach, we know that they're very good because they are a 2 times champion. However, they're not the highest 2-2 team. That goes to our current champion, and which is the Bolton Bashers. Not only are they the current champion, they also lost to a 4-0 team this week. In addition, their other loss is to a 3-1 team. So they've lost to some very good teams. In addition to losing to some very good teams, we've seen them have some incredibly close sets and have had some really cool tech, and were able to, do very well so far this season, despite having a really tough starting schedule. So up next, we have our lowest 3-1 team, which is the Pog Corrigons. I personally think they're a little bit higher than this, but I think they, definitely have shown some strength in their team. Their team, we've definitely seen how strong Bronzong is, and they've been using it very effectively. The Urshifu has been doing a lot of work, and so has the Dragalgi in recent weeks. I definitely think, we have seen a little bit of weakness in their speed, but they've definitely been able to position well and have been able to get Trick Room up pretty consistently, which kind of goes around, helps with their, not having super high base speed. So with that, number 6, we have the Cambridge Camera-Ups. The Camera-Ups, after having the very, eventful week 1 loss, have since then won 3 games in a row. We've definitely seen some cool tech on them, and they've used pretty much every Pokemon on their team pretty effectively thus far. They're definitely getting their pace to hopefully try to prove that they're the best VDLS team that got promoted, but we'll see if that happens. Next up, we have number 5, which is the Alexandria Arcanines. Arcanines got a really close win this week. They're able to, to get their 3rd win of the season. They've definitely have shown the power of Klotzer and Berserker. Those are Pokemon that they've gotten a lot of work with, significantly more than Pokemon like Urshifu, which, definitely seems like a mon that would be more impactful, but those two are definitely have been doing massive works. I think the Arcanines, definitely have had a lot of really close sets, and to get a little higher in the power rankings, I think they want to continue winning and or get a more convincing win. But so far they've been looking very impressive and doing a lot of work. Up next, we have number 4, which is Rebellion. So Rebellion added Poltegeist, and I can't remember what they dropped for it, but yeah. So, anyways, with that, Rebellion has been incredibly impressive. I personally have liked their team from the very beginning, but they've made some changes to their team, and I think it's gotten even a little better. In addition to that, the core of the 3 dogs has been incredibly impressive. They're bulky, fast, and can do huge chunks of damage, especially when you do things like Choice Band and Choice Specs like they did this week. Up next, we have number 3, which is the Pangorials. Not too surprising to see them as the highest 3-1 team because they were the week 0 power ranking number 1. In addition to that, they had a very convincing win against the Pretzels this week, and so definitely not too surprising to see them as high as they are. Next, we have our first 4-0 team, which is the Welsh Whalers. They had a very impressive win against Otto and the Trixie Tricos. Definitely a really big win for them. In addition to that, we've seen the power of both of their weather modes and the power of like Incineroar. And, they definitely deserve to be number 2, but sadly they're not number 1 because that goes to the Tyranitar Sauces, who are 4-0 plus 7. They had their first game loss this week. So before that, they hadn't even dropped a single game. They had an incredibly impressive win this week. And in addition to that, they've definitely shown the strengths of their team and the strengths of some mons that don't seem like they're likely to see huge chunks of play, and definitely using them in some interesting ways and having some interesting techs. With that, here is our final rankings of the week 4 power rankings. I don't think there's too much to say except that, for reference, pretty much every team still has a chance at playoffs, so don't give up. If obviously some people's paths to playoffs are a lot easier than others, but everyone is currently still eligible to make playoffs, and so don't give up. Keep on trying. This is coming from somebody who's currently 1-3, so trust me, don't give up. You have your chance, and hopefully we have some interesting matches, and hopefully some of these 1-3 teams can make playoffs like they've done in previous seasons. So with that, thank you for watching, and I hope you all enjoyed.